Welcome everybody to Chapter 39 of Book 1 of the Ranger's Apprentice The Early Years series, The Tournament at Gorlan. Let's go ahead and get into it. There's little doubt now that Morgoth will challenge you, Halt said. Errol shrugged casually. There never was. I can take care of myself. Still, said Duncan, he's a snake in the grass, and he'll do his best to kill you. Again, Errol was unfazed by the comment. He might find I'm a tougher nut to crack than young Wallace, he said, and even he wouldn't dare to try and claim a misunderstanding like the other day. Keep an eye on him, nonetheless, said Crowley. They were seated once more in the armorer's tent in Errol's compound. Duncan, Pritchard, Halt, Crowley, and Farrell were present, discussing plans for the melee later that morning. Errol regarded Farrell. The burly ranger had constructed a wooden replica of his battle-axe to use in the melee. Only practice weapons were allowed, and an axe, even with blunted edges, was considered too dangerous to use in the event. "Are you ready?" Errol asked Farrell. The ranger nodded. "Don't worry. We'll definitely cramp Teasel's style." "How many of you?" asked Errol. "Just 2. That'll be enough to take them by surprise. A bigger group might draw attention. We could be disqualified by the marshals. And the more of us there are, the more chance of Teasel realizing what's going on." Errol nodded. He had a good idea who would be assisting Farrell in the melee, but he decided to say nothing. At that moment, Mistress Pauline entered the tent. "Teasel and his group will be fighting in the Blue Force," she said, placing 2 scarlet armbands on the table. "I've had you 2 registered with the Reds." Errol wasn't surprised when Farrell retrieved the 2 armbands and handed one to Duncan. "You're sure about this, my lord?" Errol said. Duncan nodded. "I owe these people a few bruises," he said grimly. "And with the possible exception of yourself, I'm the best fighter we have. We need to thin Teasel's group out quickly, then get off the field." "So long as you're not noticed and recognized," Crowley put in. Duncan turned his gaze on him. "I'll be wearing a full-face helmet," he said, "and it's been a long time since I've had one of those knocked off my head." They heard a rustle of canvas as the outer door screen was pulled aside, then replaced. Then the inner screen opened in turn. The double screen had been Crowley's idea, to prevent spying eyes from seeing into the tent where they were conferring. Martin, the Baron's secretary, entered, a worried expression on his face. "My lord, serious news," he said, and Errol gestured for him to continue. Martin glanced around the table to make sure everyone was listening, then announced, "Tiller is dead." There were startled exclamations from the assembled group. Duncan held up his hand for silence. "Dead?" he queried. "How did this happen?" Martin shrugged uncomfortably. "It appears that he took poison, my lord." "Took it, or was given it?" Crowley put in. "There's no way of knowing that, sir," Martin said unhappily. He felt that Tiller's death reflected badly on him. He was in charge of the Redmont camp's administration. He could have had the poison concealed on him all this time. "Surely he was searched," Duncan said. Crowley interjected. "My men searched him for weapons, but poison could have been concealed anywhere on his person or in his clothes." Still, It's something of a coincidence that he managed to get his hands on poison just when we were about to use him to denounce Morgoth," said Halt. The others muttered agreement, but Lady Pauline disagreed with the general views around the table. "It's really no great loss," she said. "His evidence wouldn't have been conclusive. Morgoth could always claim that we'd recruited him and coerced him into the accusation. He would have provided useful corroborating evidence of Morgoth's guilt, but that would have been all." The others looked at her, realizing she was right. Pritchard was the first to speak. "The key witness is still going to be King Oswald," he said. "That's always been the case, and now this feud between Earl and Morgoth will give us our best chance to set him free." "How so?" asked Earl. "Your interfering in this fight with young Wallace has infuriated him. He's fixated on making you pay for it, and that means his attention will be distracted from young Oswald. Your duel will provide a perfect opportunity for us to get into the castle and release him. You can be sure his own followers will be distracted by the event too. Security is sure to be slack." "Assuming, of course, that he does challenge you," Pauline said. Earl smiled at her. "Oh, he will. And if he doesn't, I'll challenge him." Outside, they heard the brazen note of multiple trumpets sounding from the jousting field. "That's the first call for the melee," Earl said. He glanced at Duncan and Farrell. "You two had better get ready, and for pity's sake, be careful," he added, looking directly at Duncan. Farrell smiled. "Don't you want me to be careful, my lord?" Earl treated him to a mock scowl. "I can always get another ranger," he said. "Round here, they're as thick as fleas on a stray dog. But we only have one heir to the throne." The dividing fence down the center of the jousting field had been removed for the grand melee. The two sides, each wearing their distinctive colored armbands, formed up in 3 rows at either end of the field. Already the crowd was buzzing with excitement. The grand melee was a popular event with the spectators. It was a guaranteed source of violence and action. The individual fights that took place gave spectators ample opportunity to wager on their outcomes, and there was always the attraction of wagering on either the red or the blue side to be triumphant at each stage of the melee. On the blue side, Teasel mustered his 6 fighters around him. "Remember who we're targeting," he said. They had been briefed on a dozen knights whom Morgoth wanted removed from contention, and they had spent the morning memorizing their crests and individual insignia. The 6 men, clad in chainmail, wearing pot helmets, and carrying an assortment of drill swords, clubs, and maces, all nodded. One, however, raised a hand in doubt. "Sir David of Holder and Maurice of Norgate are on the blue side," he pointed out. "Aren't they our allies in the melee?" Teasel regarded him scornfully. "We're here to get rid of them. If they're wearing blue, they'll be that much easier," he said. "They won't be expecting us to attack them. Just get behind them and hit them hard and fast. Nobody'll notice in the confusion." The trumpets rang out, sounding the 1-minute warning signal. Teasel set his shield a little more firmly on his left arm, and drew the weighted wooden sword from his belt. "1 minute to go," he said. "Get ready." A minute later, the trumpets blared long and loud, and, with a roar, the two sides charged across the field at each other. As the first ranks crashed into each other, and weapons began to rise and fall, Teasel found himself behind Sir Maurice of Norgate. Teasel glanced quickly around to make sure nobody was watching, but the blue force were all intent on the enemy facing them. Quickly, he brought his sword down onto the warrior's helmet. Morris staggered, looking round in alarm. He hadn't realized that an enemy had got behind him. He saw a black-clad fighter a few meters away, then saw the wooden sword swinging toward his forearm. The bone cracked as the blow landed, and Morris cried out in pain and anger. Then the black-clad man backhanded the pommel of his sword into Morris's face, and he went down under a surge of trampling feet. "Come on!" Teasel yelled to his small force, and they followed him through the struggling mass, forming a wedge behind him as they sought their next victim. "There!" Farrell yelled, pointing with his axe at the little formation forcing its way through the melee. In a series of disorganized individual combats, it was easy to see Teasel's group working together as they surrounded one of the red fighters. Farrell recognized their target as a warrior from the fief of one of Errold's supporters, and he shoved his way through the fighting mass of men to get to him. "Take them from behind," Duncan yelled, and they swung in behind the 6 men who were surrounding the knight as he desperately tried to defend himself. But there were too many attackers, and he was taking blow after blow from the wooden weapons. Duncan slammed his shield into the side of one of Teasel's men, sending him flying. The man stumbled, fell to his knees, where an enthusiastic member of the Red Force, seeing his chance, brought a wooden mace crashing down on his head. Duncan didn't bother to see what happened to his first victim. He went at the rest of Teasel's group like a battering ram, his heavy wooden sword flashing from side to side, beating down his opponent's defenses, finding the small gaps left unprotected by their shields, and delivering crushing injuries. They went down before him like wheat before the scythe. Some turned away, nursing broken limbs. Others crashed to the turf, unconscious. Duncan was a master warrior, powerful, fast, and pitiless, while Teasel's men were, for the most part, semi-skilled bully boys, accustomed to striking from behind and with overwhelming numbers in their favor. Too late, Teasel realized that his troop had been cut down by the terrifying red-clad knight, who moved through them like a hurricane, his sword rising and falling, sweeping and thrusting almost too fast for the eye to follow its blur of motion. He turned to see if any of his men had survived these first violent few minutes, and found himself facing a grim, heavy-set man in chainmail and a surcoat bearing Errold's blue and yellow colors. The man smiled at him and brandished his heavy wooden axe. "Didn't turn out quite how you planned?" he asked. Morgoth's henchman realized that he had been outwitted. Instead of targeting Errold's followers, he and his men had been targeted themselves by these 2 fighters. With a scream of rage, he swung an overhand blow at the man. Farrell's drill axe was fashioned like his real one. The cutting edge of the blade was a crescent of hardwood, with a supporting center strut connecting it to the long haft. The ends of the crescent extended past the center strut, giving him a large striking surface without the prohibitive weight of a solid blade. As a result, there was a gap between the top quarter of the blade and the haft of the axe. He used this now to his advantage, trapping the descending sword blade in the gap and twisting savagely to spin the sword out of its owner's hand. Teasel looked aghast as his weapon flew through the air. Then the flat of Farrell's axe slammed against his head. He was wearing a helmet, but it did little to stop the concussive force of the blow. His eyes glazed, and his knees sagged as he sank to the ground. Above him, he was dimly aware of the red-clad knight dropping his hand onto the axeman's shoulder. He heard the words he said as if the knight were a long way away. "They're done. Let's get out of here." As Teasel sank into unconsciousness, Farrell and Duncan shoved their way back through the ranks of the Red Force, stripping off their armbands as they went. A group of brown and gray-cloaked men were standing ready by the rail to the public viewing. As the two fighters scrambled under it, the Rangers bundled them in cloaks and spirited them away, out of sight. And that will bring us to the end of chapter number 39. As always, thank you all for joining me, thank you for listening, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time in chapter 40. God bless, and have a good one.